Well, I grew up in Perth Andover, New Brunswick in the early 1960s, and we really didn't have much in organized sports or activities. So what we did most of the time was look after ourselves. We played softball, baseball, basketball. Once in a while we could get into the local gym and play volleyball, but most of the time we were just outside. We used to hike a lot, fished a lot, and just had a good time.
Well, I grew up in Riverview, New Brunswick, so it's kind of like a tri-city area with Moncton, Dieppe, in Riverview. So it was a pretty big area. What did we do for fun as teens? Like in high school, a lot of the time, actually, we would just go from, like in my group of friends, we would go from house to house and like we'd play board games or watch movies, things like that. Maybe we go to the mall.
It was quite interesting back then. It was quite strict. English was English, and we had, I guess we used to have 7 periods a day. I went to Southern Victoria High School, and the teachers were strict, but they were fair, and we just, there was only about 400 students in our school, so you knew everybody, and everybody knew you. As for misbehaving or punishment, I was at basically the end of the leather strap era. There was a few kids that you used to have to hold your hand out, and the teacher would whack you a couple of times on the hand. But that was kind of at the end of my high school years or junior high school years. Most of the time, what we got to do is stay after school and pretend to study.
So high school was pretty typical. I would say teachers were, I would say, pretty strict. I don't really remember a lot of issues in terms of like people skipping school or being late for school because it just wasn't really allowed, right? And I will say that although I had a lot of nice teachers that were kind of funny and fun at different times, I would say that most classes were based on like instruction and worksheets and tests and instruction and worksheets and tests. Like it wasn't a lot of like creative teaching. I don't remember it being like that anyway. Classes. There was one year school went under a bit of a change, and my classes were 90 minutes long. We went to a kind of a semestered uh, system where I only took 2 classes in the morning and 2 classes in the afternoon, and they were 90 minutes apiece, which was fun if you were in gym class for 90 minutes, but math, after like an hour, you were ready to be done.
Well, when I was a kid, that was before Toronto Blue Jays or Toronto Raptors, and even before the Montreal Expos. So, if you were a baseball fan, you were a Boston Red Sox fan. If you were a hockey fan, you either hated Toronto and loved Montreal, or loved Montreal and hated Toronto. Our favorite sport, I guess, that back then was what we call screen ball. And I imagine kids these days don't even know what screen ball is. But what we used to do, um, the batter used to stand on the pitcher's mound and look towards the screen. The pitcher, who used to lob a softball, stood on the batter's box and lobbed the ball towards the batter, who was on the pitcher's mound. By the way, you had to bat the opposite way, and you tried to hit the ball onto the screen. If you hit the lower part of the screen, you got a single. If you hit the middle part of the screen, you got a double. If you hit the top part of the screen, it was a home run. If you hit it over the screen, 3 out. But we used to play that constantly all summer.
My favorite sports team, I don't know, I actually didn't watch a lot of team sports on TV, I would say. I remember always supporting the Washington Redskins in football, mostly because they were in the Super Bowl once against the Raiders, which my brother liked, so I chose the other team. If I had to pick a team maybe in late high school, it probably was the Blue Jays, because just after that was when they were getting really big and won a couple of World Series. As far as my friends and I go playing sports, we actually played a lot of tennis. For whatever reason, the circle of friends that I was in, we all liked tennis, and there were tennis courts around our house, so it was convenient and fun and easy to do.
Well, back then we used to, let me think. I would have to say my least favorite subject was Latin. And the reason, I guess the reason for that is we had the same teacher for what was then English 1, English 2. English 1 was written, English 2 was more like reading. And the same teacher had us for English 1, English 2, and Latin 2 or 3 times a week. And Latin was always the last period of the day. So back then you were just about tired of the teacher and just about tired of school for the day. So I'd say Latin was my least favorite. My favorite subject, I guess, would have to be one of the sciences like biology.
My favorite subjects in school were definitely the sciences, but particularly like biology and environmental science. I remember my teacher was pretty fun and good, and I was really good at those too. So I liked those ones. I don't really remember doing too many, say, particularly interesting labs in those classes, except for maybe a frog dissection in biology in high school. Definitely my least favorite were my math classes. I never really enjoyed math in high school. I remember I had one teacher whose last name was Clifford, and he was as exciting as that sounded.
Back in high school, I guess that was the start of the Beatles. And everybody at that time used to wear their hair quite short. And of course, when the Beatles and everybody else moved to the States and Canada, everybody then wanted to grow their hair longer. Well, the principal of the school basically he had no hair, so he was a little jealous to start with. But Beatle haircuts, oh no, you couldn't do that. So really, Beatle haircuts, bell-bottom pants, I guess that was a trend.
I will say that particularly in clothes, there were lots of trends in high school. I went to school in Riverview, and I would say it was very like cliquey and I don't know, higher socioeconomic area, I would say, for that Moncton area. So people were all about brand names, brand names, brand names. So polo shirts were popular. But I also remember in high school, like the must-have items were Varney shirts, Chip and Pepper shirts or pants, which were like those crazy, like ridiculous, giant, puffy pants. Those were definitely some of the huge trends that came in. And as far as hair goes, there were a lot of guys who had like 90210 hair, so kind of slicked up and heavily sprayed across the front. I was guilty as charged there. Yeah, so those were some of the big ideas.
Again, it was the Beatles. Beatles were brand new. I do remember the very first night the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show. They were on Ed Sullivan. He used to have a musical comedy show every Sunday night, and I don't think there was a person in North America that didn't tune in to Ed Sullivan. The first night the Beatles sang "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and from then on it was the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Turtles, just everything from then into Steppenwolf. As for television shows, I'd have to say it was the first one I remember was Bonanza, the Cartwright family, and there was a lot of comedy shows and like the Ed Sullivan Show, the Carol Burnett Show, where they had talent and singing and comedians, and it was just general family entertainment. Those are the ones that I remember.
As far as TV shows go, I used to love the original Roseanne sitcom that was on back in the 90s. That was hugely popular back then. But probably my number one show I remember in high school was watching Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. That's when that show originally aired, and we used to look forward to that every week. That show was awesome. Also in high school, where kind of like when I was in high school, pop singers were huge at that time. That's when Mariah Carey became famous, Michael Bolton became famous, and even bands like New Kids on the Block were still kicking around at that time. So it was a big pop music time in the kind of early 90s.
Back in the 60s, I guess I grew up in a border town. Perth Andover is only 8 kilometers from the United States border, and Fort Fairfield, Maine, and Perth Andover, we used to hang out back and forth. We used to play them in baseball and basketball. It was quite competitive between the two areas. And that was back, unfortunately, during the Vietnam era. And I do remember a lot of the kids that I grew up with from Fort Fairfield ended up in Vietnam. And I do think it was very, well, it was a troublesome time. And I know it bothered a lot of us. And we all lost people we knew in Vietnam. So I really think in our later teenage years, the concern was that Canada might get drawn into it, and we'd end up getting drafted and ended up in Vietnam.
Some issues I would say in the '90s was kind of a really big recession. There was like the Gulf War and things like that, so it caused a massive recession and lot in North America as a whole, and lots of people lost jobs. So I would think kind of like parental unemployment was kind of an issue for kids. I mean that that whether parents are employed affects the kids too, obviously. So I think that was maybe one of the biggest things I can think of at the time.
That was a tough one because I, I, I don't really remember too many of slang terms. I guess now you always think of rad and cool, but I think one of the biggest ones was dig it. Can you dig it, man? That was when you were really into stuff, and maybe you were listening to a new tune, and you'd ask your friends if can you dig that tune, meaning can you really get into it. That was, if you asked me for one expression that we used to use a lot, it would be kind of that.
Maybe it's where I grew up, but I don't really remember using a lot of slang, to be honest. I really thought about this question, and I can't think of something that people used. I mean, besides just basic words like saying awesome and cool and whatever, but that's not really slang. So I don't really remember that as being kind of part of the language.
Again, I have to say we grew up in little old Perth Andover. Jobs were few and far between, but one thing we all did, and I'd say about 90% of the kids in high school used to work in the potato harvest crop. We used to plain old pick potatoes. We all had little baskets. They were about 30-pound baskets, and you actually, when the tractor went by with a potato digger, you had a little section, and your job was to pick all the potatoes off the ground, put them in a basket, pour them into a barrel. So I guess we were potato pickers, and we used to get paid by the amount of barrels that we picked in the run of a day. Average person maybe could pick between 40 and 50 barrels a day. Some people might have got 70. And we used to get between 17 and 20 cents for every barrel we picked. Most of the time, with whatever money we got, most of the kids used it to buy their winter clothing. Winter jacket, winter boots, that's what there was no money left over for, I'll say, to buy a new bike or whatever. Like, most of it went into the house.
My first job was at McDonald's in Moncton, actually. I just had to hop on a bus after school, and it was like a 2 or 3 minute bus ride across the causeway to the McDonald's where I worked. I loved it. I was employee of the month 3 times, and I even had my picture up in the lobby for like 6 months because nobody else would get their picture taken, so that was annoying. But lots of kids that I knew at high school had jobs at the mall or at local shops or restaurants or whatever. So it was a pretty common thing.
Well, I guess what everybody should miss that time of their life is when you really, at that age, you should not have too many worries and cares. I had I guess a childhood where I can say I was very happy and didn't have much stress. The kids that I hung around with didn't have much stress, and I really think that is what the world is missing today. Maybe we put too much stress on our young people, but it was a real good time, and we had a real enjoyable youth, and that's the part I guess I miss.
Okay, so I'm going to be honest and say almost nothing. I didn't really like high school, to be honest. I moved to Riverview for high school and found it super cliquey and just a really difficult school. I had several friends that I met through different activities in the school and stuff like that, but just never really kind of found my stride there in high school. So although I love like middle school in that time of my life and university in that time of my life, high school was not a time that I cared for, and don't really miss, except for maybe a couple of good friends at that time, don't really miss much of anything.